Professor Kleiman will talk a little bit with us about the research behind swift and certain and how it connects to natural networks. So with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Kleiman.
Thanks, Maurice. I should note that I added the Journal of Drug Policy Analysis. We both tell me that it's Bo does all the work and I take the credit, which is a perfectly reasonable deal, I think. So my assignment from David was to talk about the sort of basic science of this. What are we really, what principles are we using? I'm not going to talk directly about the research into the national network's specific application. So there are two broad lines of theorizing that suggest that this stuff ought to work and is needed. And they come from completely different research traditions, so this is going to be a little bit of intellectual. So one idea is, imagine you're trying to enforce any rule, and there's a group of people with some incentive to disobey the rule. I mean, they'd rather do it than not if they're not going to get caught and punished. And that you have a limited amount of ability to punish people who break the rule. Under those circumstances, the following things would be true. If everybody's behaving, then it makes sense for everybody to behave. Because whoever gets out of line, you've got enough capacity to punish. And then he gets back in line. So think about a well-behaved classroom. And Johnny throws a spitball. And Mrs. Jones says, "Don't do that, Johnny." And everybody in the class learns that you can't get away with that in Mrs. Jones' classroom. Now imagine a disorderly classroom where there are two fistfights going on. And Johnny throws a spitball. The teacher is sufficiently occupied by calming the two fistfights so that Johnny gets ignored. And he and everybody else learns that you can get away with throwing spitballs in Mrs. Robinson's classroom. And that therefore gets to be a persistently disorderly classroom. So this is the phenomenon that I have described as enforcement swamping. The enforcement system can get overwhelmed by the level of violations. The technical term for that is probation department. Once everybody's breaking the rules, everybody keeps breaking the rules. And unless you've got a punishment capacity theory that will come down and give you more capacity than you currently have, there's no way out of that swamp if you try to control everybody at once. However, whatever limited capacity you have is enough to control some number of people, right? Because, again, the hypothesis here is that you have a punishment such that if people knew they were going to be punished every time, they wouldn't want to break the rule. That's not worth it. So let me take the number of punishments I have and pick that number of people and say, okay, you 5. I don't care what anybody else does. If you get out of line, you're going to get whacked. Well, once they've tested a couple of times and discovered that I mean it, they're going to stop breaking the rule. And once they're not breaking the rule, then I have some capacity left. And I can go to number 6 and I say, okay, you 2. Never taking my eye off the first 5. And then I can slowly tip the group out of the high offending equilibrium into the low offending equilibrium without ever going over my constraint. The trick is not to bluff, never to threaten a punishment that you can't actually deliver. Because once you've established the credibility of the sanctions threat, then again, on this hypothesis, people are going to do the right thing. So that's the idea of dynamic concentration in enforcement. Don't try to control everybody. Control somebody and then spread it out. Pick a group of people, pick a geographic place, pick a time, pick an offense class, and decide, okay, this we're not going to put up with, and make that an effective rule. And again, the trick is, once people are complying, it doesn't cost you much to keep them in compliance. That's the jujitsu here. So lots of people are used to using lots of punishment and nothing changes, and they conclude that punishment doesn't work. Now, what I want to say to you is punishment does work, but you have to do it right, and we mostly do it wrong. The other thing to say about this is that punishment is always cost, never benefit. Right? This is sort of hard to fit in within our adversarial criminal justice system. But punishment is always a bad thing. It may be a useful means of getting the end you want, which is compliance. But you'd much rather get the compliance without the punishment. So one way to think about it is the punishment is cost. The other way to think about it is punishment is failure. You issued a deterrent threat. The point of that was to get somebody not to do something. If he does it and you have to whack him, you failed. Now, you still have to carry out the threat to make it work the next time. But that's not what you want to do. You want there to be no punishment and no violation. So as my guru Tom Schelling says, brute force works when it's applied. A deterrent threat, when it works, never gets used. And that's the goal that I think we should be aiming at. And so that sort of leaves me in between the camps of the people who want to punish a lot and people who don't want to punish at all. I have sometimes reflected that one of the problems with the criminal justice system in this country is that the debate is conducted between the disciples of Michel Foucault and the disciples of the Marquis de Sade. And if you're too punitive for the Foucaultians and not neat enough for the sadists, you're not getting a hearing from anybody. All right, so punishment's a cost. You want to minimize its use while controlling behavior, which is to say you are looking, as David said earlier today, you're looking for the minimum effective dose of sanction. You want to use as little as you can. And I think one of the things we're learning from this work is that punishment is real cream. A little dab will do you, but only under the right circumstances. So what are the right circumstances? Well, Cesare Beccaria got the principles right 250 years ago. Swiftness and certainty matter, and severity doesn't matter. Whatever the minimum punishment is that will change behavior, we've never gotten that small. So in Hawaii, on the HOPE program, which some of you know about, drug testing, positive test result, week in jail. Very good results. And second time, 2 weeks in jail, and third time, 3 weeks in jail, or a month in jail. And then the judge, there was one judge who was doing 6 weeks the first time. He wasn't getting any better results than anybody else. So he cut back to the same 1 week. And then Steve Alm, who's the guy who was running the program, said, well, if 1 week works as well as 6 weeks, how would 2 days work? And the answer is, as well as 1 week. Well, what if you stopped escalating? Compliance curves are the same. So it turns out that 2 days, 2 days, 2 days, 2 days is just as good as a week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, except that because it's a smaller punishment, you can do it more regularly and do it more quickly. So it's, Beccaria got it right that swiftness and certainty matter and severity doesn't matter. The point that James Q. Wilson made, that everybody tends to forget, it's not just that severity isn't a good substitute for swiftness and certainty. Severity is the enemy of swiftness and certainty. The more severe a punishment is, the less often you can apply it, and the more slowly you're going to apply it because you're going to have more due process in the way. A revocation hearing on a probation violation takes a morning. A sanctions hearing under Hawaii HOPE takes 7 minutes. Your Honor, positive drug test yesterday. What's to argue about? He's going to do 2 days. It's not like we've got 9 violations going over the past year and he's facing 6 months. So, swiftness and certainty. But the other thing that, so swiftness and certainty reduce the minimum dose. But the other thing that turns out to reduce the minimum dose is fairness. Right? That's the reason I'm now insisting on saying swift, certain, fair rather than swift and certain. As Justice Holmes said, even a dog knows the difference between being stumbled over and being kicked. The economists who've studied crime, people like Gary Becker, have modeled punishment as a kind of cost that offenders put into their optimization function. That just turns out to be wrong. Effective punishment is not processed as a cost. It's processed as a just consequence. If the punishment arrives as promised, according to what seems like a fair system, so now we're back to procedurally, legitimacy and procedural justice. People take it a different way. And they're much more unwilling to incur a just punishment from a fair system than they are to take a random kick from a system they hate anyway. Knuckling under to arbitrary authority is degrading, and people don't want to do it. You get resistance. Complying with a system that makes sense is what normal human beings know how to do. So, one way to think about this is that every mother already knows these principles. Right? There's no magic here. It's just that if the criminal justice system were apparent, we'd weight it up as neglectful and abusive. Too much stuff gets ignored, and the stuff that doesn't get ignored gets handled much too harshly. So fairness is key, and the key to fairness is a warning. Right? So that's the call-in, or the warning hearing, or there's various varieties of it at both individual and group levels. You have to say up front, here you is what we don't want you doing, and here's what's going to happen to you every time you do it. And that establishes that what happens is not somebody's arbitrary whim. And the key here is you can't skip. The first time you don't punish somebody who earned it, every future punishment is on you. Because you demonstrated you could have done otherwise. So why are you mad at me today? And since word spreads, everybody else knows that other people got away with this. So why is he coming at me? He doesn't like me. Right? You want the offender to attribute the punishment to his own action, not to the whim of some official. So my other slogan here is, random mercy is toxic. You got to be consistent. So those are the two principles at work. With respect to the stuff that I mostly worked on, which is post-conviction supervision, where I'm claiming we can substitute community corrections for incarceration if we do community corrections right. That is to say, if we have a limited number of conditions, monitor compliance, and sanction violations swiftly, certainly, and fairly. So that's the HOPE program. That's the 24/7 program in South Dakota that Bo's going to talk about. That's swift and certain in Washington State, where everybody in the state, both on probation and parole, is being supervised this way with very good results. Angela Hawken now has a 7-year follow-up on the Hawaii experiment. They're still using fewer drugs. They're still spending fewer days behind bars. I should say, when the whole program went in Hawaii, true that more people spent a couple days in jail than would have on routine probation, because we didn't experiment. But they spent fewer total days in jail, and a third as many days in prison. They stopped getting convicted of new crimes, and they stopped getting revoked. So this is a punishment program that reduces punishment. The next extension is to take people currently in prison and put them out under the right kind of monitoring, and we've suggested supported housing and supported work. So that's the graduated reentry idea. We'll know whether that's a good idea in a year when somebody's tried it. On the street, right? So this is most of the National Network's work: ceasefire, drug market intervention, domestic violence interventions. Here's the new application I want to suggest. Some students were working on the sex trafficking problem in Los Angeles. It's street gangs trafficking 12, 13-year-old girls, tattooing them with the gang logo. And when the girls get picked up, they run away, because if they don't run away, they'll be beaten up. And so what I'm suggesting, we haven't gotten to LAPD about this, is, well, why not go to the gangs, you know who they are, and say, we're counting tattoos, and whichever gang scores the most tattoos in the next 6 months gets landed on. And we're taking the tattoos off, and if they go back, you're in trouble. And if one of your girls is in a non-locked facility and runs away, we're going to blame it on you, and we're going to come after your whole group. So you can do other stuff, but no, pimping little girls is actually out of line here, and we're going to treat it the way we treat homicide. No, you can't treat everything the way you treat homicide. One thing at a time. I want to suggest that sex trafficking of little girls is probably a good next candidate. And again, my suggestion is you're not going to have to do this very often before they figure something else to do for a living. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Andrew.
So now that we have a baseline of the theory, we're moved to Professor Papachristos from Yale, who will give us a little bit of the state of things, naturally social networking, as well as the state of things in Chicago. Professor Papachristos is a fully tenured professor in the
recently
fully tenured professor at the Department of Sociology at Yale University. His research applies the growing field of social network science to understanding patterns of gun cop victimization, neighborhood street gangs, and illegal gun markets. What's not listed in this bio is that he is also an expert on the FX program at Sons of Anarchy.
That's true. True.
Andy, I got one more second.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
I left out a principle, and it was very rude of me, because I left out the one principle that David personally invented, which is that everything I said was really about individual level deterrence. And David's major innovation was to say, well, wait a second. If the crimes are being committed by groups, that is, by individuals who are trying to please other members of their group, they're a lot more afraid of their friends than they are of the cops. So you can't deter gang killings by going after gang shooters. The only way to deter group behavior is with group deterrence. You've got to say to the whole organization, if somebody in your organization shoots somebody, your whole organization is in trouble. And then you turn the social capital of the group to the public purpose. So that's the other major principle here, which I didn't say because I didn't.
All right. Now that's a story.
Now that's it. So I'm going to actually talk about two. Let me start this so I don't go too far over. Two key principles I find in the work of the national network. One is this concentration of violence in small networks, and I'm going to do a little preview, but I'll talk about that at length tomorrow on the other panel. And the second is that data matters. And I'm going to organize these thoughts around a question and a declarative statement that was brought to my attention very forcefully by a Chicago cop. So the subtitle could have been "Things This Guy Learned from a Chicago Cop," two things I learned. And the question is up there right now, which is who's next, which I'll get back to that. And the other thing I'm going to talk about is the declarative statement, which is it'll never work. And those are the two sort of organizing principles, both of which I think are going to speak to some of the fundamental issues that we've talked about already. So let's start with this question. It's basically the question was, who's going to get shot next? And I was at a meeting in 2006, 2007 in Chicago trying to figure out a way to integrate some of these new ideas from the national network into Chicago. And a cop and I were having, we're close friends, we're having a very, let's just say, heated debate. And he asked me this question. He said, well, who's going to get shot next? Actually, it looked more like this. All right, you tell me, smart guy, who's going to get shot next? And he didn't want me to say a young black kid from a disadvantaged neighborhood, probably a member of a gang on the west side of Chicago, because that's like 49,000 people. So what he was actually asking me was, could we figure out who's actually at the highest rate of victimization beyond those clusters of risk factors I just named, and that we sociologists are famous for putting out there. And what I tried to do at this time, because so I took the challenge, and he didn't say smart guy, he said something else, you can fill in your choice words, right? I took the challenge and I said, I bet you I can do better. And the idea was to take what everybody already knows, right? Any good cop, any good preacher, any good school teacher, any good football coach, any good parent has a sense of the social networks that are around these individuals. And if you ask people, you can get a lot of information, And for cops in the room, you know this. I could just ask you about a particular family that has a lot of young males on the street. You could name who they're going out with. You could name who their ex-girlfriend was and who they went to school with and who they played football. And what you're doing is you're listing a social network. But here's the thing. Your brain only has so much bandwidth. And in Chicago and in other cities, cops would specialize on one area or one group, and then that was where their limit of their knowledge was. So my idea was to take this science behind networks, the stuff that drives Facebook, but also drives infectious disease. It drives your promotion and raises at work. I'll talk to you about that at cocktail hour if you want to talk about that. But the thing is, there's a lot of science behind this, and we talked a lot about it. And a lot of the original ceasefire work in Boston was doing this. Not quite on the back of the envelope, David, but you know, they weren't actually harnessing what could be done. So I had this challenge, and I said I could figure it out. Smart guy. And so this is the first time we did this was in Boston, in one community in Boston. And what we did was we took all the contact cards and the arrest records. And every time two people, and each one of those dots is a person, tenure, I can do whatever I want to do. Every one of those,
wonderful.
It's great, it's fantastic. So every one of those dots is a unique person whom we know about, as David already said. We know a lot about them. I don't know who they are, but I could give you the number, you could look them up, we could look them up in child services, we could look them up in the public health system, the criminal justice system, and every one of the ties is a link. They were arrested together, they were contacted together, and what that does is it builds a network, one bit at a time, with data that already exists. And if I were to ask one of you about the people in your caseload, you could tell me a lot about their network, but a little bit less information about the people around them and so on and so on. But one of the taglines is, just because you don't see the network doesn't mean it won't kill you. You can just think about infectious disease networks. So what you're looking at is one neighborhood in Boston. It was 6% of that neighborhood's population. There's 763 dots there. The red dots are the victims of the fatal and non-fatal gunshot injuries over a 1-year period. And that's 85% of all the gunshot victims. If you're looking at this long enough, you'll see those red dots kind of clump together. Very rarely is there one by themselves. It's like your kid took the Christmas ornaments and threw them at one part and they stuck all together. That's network clustering, and there are all kinds of bits of algorithms and clustering things we can use to understand that as soon as you're inside this network, your risk skyrockets, right? Exponentially higher, 900% higher than whatever it is in your community. If you're outside, it drops. It doesn't quite drop to the national average, but gets a lot closer. So if you're in this network, and we know who you are, we can do a lot of things. And importantly, I'm talking about victims here, but these are all individuals who have been arrested. And that'll be important as we come along the way, because we are saving lives. We're saving these young men's lives through a lot of these interventions. So this is what one neighborhood in Boston looks like. As my brother-in-law likes to remind me, Boston's not a real city. So what happens if we go to Chicago? Well, you get this. This is not an MRI. None of you will be able to see it, but there are 173,000 dots and about 12,000 gunshot victims. What I will tell you is this, the math looks almost identical. It's about 6% of the population of the entire city. It's about 70% of all the shootings. Almost 90% of those shootings happen in one network, right? So again, if you're in this network, your individual risk skyrockets, and I'm going to talk about that tomorrow. Basically, your odds are akin to playing Russian roulette, a fair game of Russian roulette at this point. And we're seeing these similar patterns using this little bit of science in other cities. Here's Newark, New Jersey. Network is slightly different. This is just one network. Here's Cincinnati, Ohio. Thanks to Robin Engel for helping me with this one. New Haven, my new home. East Palo Alto, which I learned is not Palo Alto. It's a different city altogether. Facebook is not in East Palo Alto. But what we see, even though the networks look different, is the principles are the same. They cluster the same way. And we've been using this in Chicago and elsewhere as a way to guide some of the focused deterrence message. If it's about being focused, we can do slightly better than just picking who a particular person thinks is most at risk or who might be next, in fact. And we can identify those individuals using fairly reliable data. So that was the first question, who's next? Here's one way to get at it, and I'll talk about this more tomorrow. Oh, Stockton, California, as well. The other statement, of course, I already mentioned is, it'll never work, which of course is more like this. It'll never work in Chicago, smart guy. Because at this point, I'd already left Chicago, even though I spent the first 31 years of my life there. I was all of a sudden quickly an outsider, and everyone said, look, this will never work. Boston is not Chicago, it's not New Haven, mainly because our gangs have this long history, and they're entrenched in the city in different ways. They're involved in narcotics a different way. And this is when sort of linking up with the national network really took this sort of in a new direction, which is we started doing these gang audits around the whole city. We started mapping the individuals at risk. And then all of a sudden, the focused deterrence, and I think Mark highlighted some of the issues about concentration and diffusion, because when you're fighting an infectious disease, you go to where the sources of infection are and you decide where to put your interventions. And that's what we did in Chicago. And the preliminary results are extremely encouraging. In fact, this paper is going to come out in August in Criminology and Public Policy. This is the only time I will ever utter this phrase. The nice thing about having a lot of gangs in Chicago is that you can't treat them all. And so there were some 850 factions in Chicago, gang factions. At the evaluation of these call-ins, group call-ins, 150 gangs had went. So what we did using all kinds of statistical kung fu was create an experiment and matched up gangs that got this treatment versus gangs that didn't. And this has been one of the big challenges in previous evaluations, right? If you treat people, the people that got treated, that's the behavior that should change, and their associates, right? Not the people who got the placebo, as it were. So a lot of the prior evaluations, with a few exceptions, had been just looking at aggregate crime rates going down. Well, you could take credit for things that didn't happen. I like being honest. So what we actually did was compare the people who got the treatment, the groups that got the treatment, to the groups that didn't get a treatment. And anybody that wants me to bore you with propensity score model, I'm happy to do that. But let me just show you the results. We looked at all their shooting behaviors. Total shooting, which is what you see under Mark's head. Shooting, whether or not the member of your gang was a part of a victim, and offending, whether we were suspect, rather. And what we saw was the year after a call-in, the year after you got this treatment at this meeting, we essentially saw a 23% reduction in the overall shooting behaviors and a 32% reduction in victimization. So in fact, it was more about saving the lives of the young men in the chairs. We didn't see any effect on shooting perpetration, mainly because a lot of missing data. It turns out all the shooters were described as young males wearing white t-shirt and jeans, right? These are ongoing investigations. But a dramatic reduction in victimization. Anthony Braga has done something similar in Boston. I did this along with him. Matching and controlling. Again, we saw almost a 30% drop in shootings with the groups that got the treatment, right? By sort of using these methods or some version of these methods of focusing the intervention, we see very dramatic short-term reductions. We're starting to see, although I'm not going to put a slide up there, quite comparable declines, short-term declines in New Haven as well. At least double-digit declines, and we're going to wrap that up this summer. So I'll close on that, and thanks for your time. Look forward to your questions.
It's coming up to fix the PowerPoint, but next is Thomas Abt. Professor Abt is a senior research fellow and adjunct lecturer in public policy with the program in criminal justice and policy management at the Harvard Kennedy School. He focuses his research on the use of comprehensive evidence-based approaches to reducing gun, gang, and youth violence. He's previously served as the Deputy Secretary of Public Safety to Governor Andrew Cuomo here in New York, where he oversaw all criminal justice and homeland security agencies. Before working with New York State, he served as the Chief of Staff to the Office of Justice Programs in the United States Department of Justice. So he's been able to see the state of this research as it's moved throughout the years, and he'll be giving us an update of a broader sense of the pulling levers and the evidence. Fred?
Thanks. Unfortunately, I don't think research fellows get the title of professor, although I don't correct my students, but since I'm on the panel with two professors, I'll just preemptively correct that. Sadly, I'm not going to be as funny as Mark, and I'm not going to have the poppy, the splashy graphics that Andrew had. But I would just. How good are you? That's a question I ask myself very often. But I just want to sort of comment from a policymaker's perspective, which is really what I've been doing for most of my career, on the sort of power of these contributions. I think one of the first things that has always appealed to me about Mark's work on dynamic concentration and on swift and certain is it's, as much as Mark is making lots of jokes, it is the political appeal of his work is really quite interesting, because the basic point is that progressives, generally speaking, if you want to oversimplify, want less punishment. And conservatives, generally speaking, if you want to oversimplify, want more accountability. And Mark's work basically says, and David's work, and why we're all here, says, you can have both. You can do both, and you can be effective in both. And that's very powerful and politically salient. And I think that Andrew's work this social networking, I think I'm going to talk a little bit about a core theme of effectiveness, which is specificity. And I think that this underpinning of social networking is a key element of specificity, which I think is tied not just to effectiveness in crime control, but also to legitimacy. So so I'm going to sort of do the wrap-up presentation in some ways. So just about evidence generally. The good news is that we have more and better research produced today on crime and violence than ever before. But unfortunately, we need a stronger emphasis on the synthesis, the emphasis, and the practice components. And I've put what that actually means in plain English there. You know, it's very hard, I know, when you're a practitioner to have any sense of keeping up on all of these things. And it's incredibly important, and this is, you know, what Assistant Attorney General Mason has worked on, and we've, when I was at Justice, we also worked on making sure that we're trying to build all of those steps in that research to practice bridge. So let's talk a little bit about that today. So one important contribution in this area, particularly with regard to synthesis, is the Campbell systematic reviews. They summarize the best available research on a specific question by synthesizing the results of multiple studies. They do that as a matter of professional judgment, but they also use a statistical technique called meta-analysis. There's an important difference between what we call a literature review and a systemic review. And the basic point of a systemic review, and I'm really diving into this because I'm doing one now, is that a systemic review sets out all of its search and research and protocols in advance. So it's not it's not something that allows the academic to pick and choose as they go along. And that adds a level of rigor, and as for you as a practitioner, if you see a systemic review, you can look at the methodology of that systemic review, what they looked at, what they didn't look at, what they decided to include, what they didn't include, and it can be very helpful. Lastly, the Campbell review is very well recognized, and it's credible and viewed in the field, and that's important. It's going to be important to your principals when you recommend ideas. Then, you know, just from a risk aversion idea, if you're putting something forward that's supported by the Campbell review or has, you know, the effective rating in crime solutions, that's an important component that you can bring to your boss. So, not surprisingly, there's been a Campbell review on focused deterrence. And here's basically what it said. It was conducted by Anthony Braga and David Weisberg. It was published in 2012. And it searched for studies of focused deterrence with a comparison group. And you heard Andy mention a comparison group. This is my personal sort of take on sort of the hierarchy of evidence, but generally speaking, for those of you in the practice world, you have non-experimental evidence, you have quasi-experimental evidence, and you have experimental evidence. Non-experimental is considered the lowest, experimental is considered the highest, and generally speaking, if you want to have a program that is recognized by one of these program registries, that is going to be sort of viewed as a serious evidence-based program, you need to at least have a well-designed quasi-experimental design. And that's what the Campbell collaboration was searching for. That's what Andy's was that he was just discussing. So they out of about 1,000 abstracts that they found, they culled that down to about 10, or to exactly 10 non-randomized quasi-experimental studies. And here you can see the main conclusion. While the evaluation evidence needs to be strengthened, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit later, the existing evidence suggests that these new approaches are noteworthy. So let's take a look at why they thought that. Well, it's pretty obvious. So in Boston, youth homicide down 63% after a focused deterrence. In Indianapolis, down 32%. In Stockton, down 42%. In Project Safe Neighborhoods in Lowell, down 44%. and so on. Boom, 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 boom. Consistently strong results. You can see that 8 of the 10 are focused on the sort of original Operation Ceasefire, focused on typically on gun violence, but you have 2 drug market interventions there at the bottom. And here's the meta-analysis, and what the sort of end result of a meta-analysis is something called effect size. That's that little red dot of the average at the bottom. And the effect size in this case was a 0.6. And generally speaking, the statistical conventions range that say a 0.5 is a moderate effect, and a 0.8 is a strong effect. But in this area, criminal justice, social science, this is actually a pretty strong effect, so it's notable. So this is some really good evidence about what we know. The Campbell collaboration took a serious look at it, and I think that this is really sort of should really advance the question in terms of focused deterrence. Is it evidence-based? And in fact, you see in Crime Solutions looked at this and drew some of its ratings from this, and a lot of the individual programs in Crime Solutions that are focused deterrence are either rated promising or effective. So putting it all together, one of the things that appeals to me about focused deterrence is not just that it has a robust support in evidence, but that it has a lot of elements of other evidence-based interventions. So here you can see, and this is just my crude way of showing, hey, these things are all interrelated. This really rough Venn diagram. But you can see, you know, Mark talked about swift and certain. We've talked about procedural justice. We've talked about problem-oriented policing, I believe was mentioned maybe earlier. Social networks, as Andy talked about, and collective efficacy, sort of pioneering work by Rob Sampson at Harvard. One of the exciting things about focused deterrence is you can see themes in the focused deterrence approach of all of these things, and all of these things have evidence backing them. And so I think that that's a very important component that says, you know, if you're looking at focused deterrence, you're probably in the right area. So we've talked about all of these different, we've talked about focused deterrence, we've talked about how it relates to other evidence-based concepts and strategies. One of the things that I'm doing this summer and probably through the fall for USAID is I'm attempting to synthesize all of the evidence on youth violence reduction for the benefit of the agency so that it can advise countries in Latin and particularly Central America. And so this is sort of a preview, not of the actual research because that research hasn't been completed, but this is a preview of where I think we're going to end up based on what I've studied so far and what we know so far. So what are some of the key themes of evidence-based approaches? Because one of the difficult things with evidence-based policy is often it's not feasible to literally pick up a program and do it exactly the same in a new setting. Different setting, they have different capacity, they have different leadership, they have different structure. So sometimes what you need is you need to be able to explain in a coherent way what's really working about this. If you can't literally do this, what's really working about this? So here are the core elements of effectiveness that I believe for violence reduction. And then I'm going to talk about how focused deterrence matches up with each of these. So first, specificity. Everything that we've learned about crime and violence over the past 20 years or so, I would say, tells us that crime is sticky. It concentrates. It concentrates among certain people, in certain places, and around certain behaviors. It's not evenly distributed. And so that suggests great efficiencies, as Mark was discussing. And focused deterrence recognizes this. It focuses on a specific behavior, shutting down open drug markets or focusing on shootings, and on those most at risk, those people who are operating the drug market or those who are most likely to shoot or be shot. The second theme is proactivity. When possible, you need to address crime and violence before it happens, either through deterrence or through prevention. Obviously, focused deterrence is working on prevention, but it also involves clear offers to help, a prevention technique. It's not, and I just want to make a point, it's not that catching criminals and reacting after the fact isn't necessary. It's absolutely necessary. And in fact, impunity outside this country, but particularly in neighborhoods of concentrated disadvantage in this country, it's a real issue. And that's sort of, you can read Jill Levy's book, Ghettocide, really sort of brings that to light. It's not that that's not important. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's not enough, and that's important to remember. So, what are the other key points? As we heard this morning, again and again and again, and if we've learned anything over the past year, although many of us in this room have known this for a long time and have been working on this for a long time, legitimacy is absolutely essential. And what you want is interventions that create a positive feedback loop between informal and informal social control. And what I mean by that is formal social control is obviously what law enforcement is doing. Informal social control is about how communities regulate themselves. And actually, Andy has done great work on this, talking about legal realism and also, as I mentioned, Rob Sampson. And what you want is, if the community views the police as legitimate, that not only aids the police in their ability to control crime and violence, but it enhances the community's ability to police itself. But unfortunately, the opposite is also true. If the community does not believe that the police are legitimate, then that undermines their ability to police themselves as well. And there's a concept called legal cynicism that Andy has really documented, that if a community doesn't feel that the police are there to help them or there to protect them, then violence will go up in that community. And then the last one. I think this is probably obvious to every practitioner, but it really bears mentioning, which is you can have the fanciest possible program, the most evidence-based design, and it can be beautiful on paper. But if you don't implement correctly, and if you don't have the right partners and the right leadership and the right amount of funding and the right staffing, it's just not going to work. And this is something that happens sort of again and again, especially in this sort of world of evidence-based policy. A program that everybody thinks is great fails. And then there's a huge debate. And often what comes out is the issue of fidelity. They said they were doing the intervention, but they didn't really do it. And they didn't really invest in it the right way. So implementation. And obviously, that's really, in a lot of ways, what the National Network is here to do. It offers technical assistance and training and introduces you to a community to make sure that you have that assistance. And so those are four sort of core principles of effectiveness. And as you can see, focused deterrence really lines up quite well with them. So what's next in terms of the research and in terms of the future of focused deterrence? This is just my view. David would know much better. Many of you would know much better. I think that in terms of focused deterrence, we need to go deeper and we need to go more broadly. So in terms of deeper, the big criticism that the Campbell collaboration had was they didn't say that the focused deterrence didn't work. What they said is we're lacking that most rigorous level of evidence, that experimental evidence from a randomized controlled trial. And so what they suggested is the next step in terms of evaluation is to do an RCT. Now, there are real limitations and difficulties with doing that, particularly because in this area, the measurement is place-based, and we don't need to necessarily get into the details of that. But one of the things that I think we need to have a discussion about is research is in some ways a means to an end. And what I would suggest is when we're asking ourselves whether we need a massive new evaluation of focused deterrence, the question I would ask is, is there something that that evaluation would give us that we're not already getting? And I don't know the answer to that. And I think that, and I'd be interested to know what Mark and Andy think about that. And then on the practical side, I would just point out that we need to think more about how focused deterrence, and this is something that David is doing and Amy is doing, and that I think the network is really actively exploring, thinking about how focused deterrence interacts with other effective crime control and violence control strategies. And I participated in a very exciting session here a few months ago about how the interplay between focused deterrence and street work, which was extremely interesting. I'm looking forward to it. And just to sort of toot my own horn and Mike Green from DCJS's horn and our work here in New York, when I was here in New York, we started something that I think was pretty unusual called GIVE, Gun-Involved Violence Elimination. And what GIVE did is it created a funding mechanism and a network to blend not only a single evidence-based strategy, of which focused deterrence featured prominently and continues to feature prominently, but multiple evidence-based strategies. And it started to get, and the idea was, how do you get jurisdictions to start thinking about, okay, we know hotspots policing works if we do it right. We know focused deterrence works if we do it right. How do they work together? Where does procedural justice fit into this? Where does SEPTED fit into this? Julia Ryan and Lisk has done a lot of great work on this. How do all of these things fit together? Because one of the things that we know, I think we all know intuitively, is that these problems are persistent and they're complicated. And so it's no surprise that there's no one single intervention that is going to get you all the way there. But one of the things that I would say increasingly, because of all the things that we've been talking about, because of the evidence that the Campbell Review has shown, because of the way that focused deterrence and the national network have been able to pick up and evolve and incorporate these other evidence-based notions, I think we should think about whether focused deterrence can often be your sort of anchor initiative. And I think that that's an exciting idea. And I'll stop there.
Okay, so we've now gone until 4:30, so I think we'll just open it up for questions and skip the moderated discussion section so we can maximize your question and answer period. So if you just want to raise your hand or come to the microphones, we can get the microphones back to you. There we go. John.
Kind of a personal thing for us, really fun.
You should be able to pull it out, actually.
Hello. Here. Great panel, great conference. I'm from Illinois, and I've been thinking a lot about this, and I think what's really important about focused deterrence and Mark's work is that it's making us kind of rethink what we're even trying to do, kind of the outcomes that we're looking at. And I'm wondering here, I'd like to kind of throw out a few other outcomes for you all to kind of respond to. It seems to me one of the most important things with, especially with focused deterrence, and I think what Mark's been doing is all the networkability, or the kind of the presence of deterrence, in the sense that people have to see, right? I mean, I think if people, it's the performance of the call-ins, you know, it's the way that community is actually able to kind of see and engage. I think it's really important, it's something we should think about as what are the outcomes we're looking at in terms of best practices, you know, that if a process is kind of hidden or poorly understood, there can be no real spillover effect, and also we don't, well, it's a real missed opportunity. I think kind of the anchoring point, it seems to me that, you know, focused deterrence, of course, it's important that we're reducing gun violence and reducing the most, you know, serious crimes, but I think on some level, kind of to get there is that kind of collaborativeness that you require of government is so important. And if you get that right, you know, the trends might go up and down, but you're going to have a foundation, do all kinds of other stuff. So to get focused deterrence right means you're doing so much else right beforehand, which on something that I think is not as important as reducing homicides, but it's foundational. And finally, I like to suggest, and maybe all these values and goals are kind of implicating other goals, but I think the goal of parsimony, of course I get from Jeremy Travis and the National Research Council, maybe it's a part of fairness, but I think it's also a little bit different, and we're kind of teasing out and thinking about that focused deterrence and, well, systems of punishment in general should go for the least amount of harm possible. So anyway, I'd just be interested in hearing your reactions to that.
So you want to take lead on that? like Mark's ready to jump.
So, parsimony for sure, looking for the smallest effective dose. What I really want to pick up on is a point that is sort of a good news, bad news story. Yes, if you do one of these right, you must be doing a lot of other stuff right. But the way to turn that over is to say, this is actually hard. Just the blocking and tackling of this stuff is hard, partly because it's usually interagency. And Adele Harrell did a study of a swift, certain, fair program in the DC drug court. David knows this story. And it took 6 months to persuade the judges to just try the experiment of using testing and sanctions instead of treatment mandate. And within 2 weeks of the experiment starting, the people in the testing and sanctions had stopped their heroin use. And after 6 months, they reported the results, very strong results for the testing and sanctions program, 1/3 the expenditure, 3 times the recovery rate. And the judges immediately went back to doing it the old way. And so Adele's conclusion from the experiment was, changing addict behavior is easy. Changing judge behavior is hard. Well, judge behavior, police behavior, prosecutor behavior, probation officer behavior. This is going to work or not depending on whether we get a randomized controlled trial to show it works. Of course it works if you do it right. The question is, can you do it right? Now, the question that Thomas asked, the answer to the question depends on whether the decision makers are sophisticated enough to want evidence-based practice and unsophisticated enough to believe that a randomized controlled trial would actually add to our knowledge of this problem. And it's entirely possible that that's where they are. That would not be the top of my research agenda on this.
Andrew, I wanted to ask you about the spillover effect.
Yeah. So the spillover effect, Maurice, in terms of the people who attend or in general?
Both.
All right, so the other thing I learned about hanging out with cops is that if there are more than 2 cops in the room, you're supposed to talk shit about firefighters. So it turns out we can actually, any firefighters in the room? Okay, so it turns out there was this great experiment about firefighters who it turns out are obese. And the problem with being a firefighter and being obese is that there are times when being obese is not good for your job, like when you have to move very fast to save people's lives. So there was a famous networked experiment that randomized a weight loss program among firefighters in a large city, and they randomized houses, firehouses. And the program, which was an experiment, was highly successful. On average, they lost something like 10 pounds. The spillover effect, which was unanticipated but an entirely networked phenomenon, was that their spouses and partners lost 5 pounds, right? So the value added was the 10 pounds, but in fact, the average loss, if you counted other people in their networks, was 15 pounds, right? So part of what we're trying to study in Chicago with the custom notifications is exactly this sort of spillover, because that's how networks work, right? So when you have a program, and just to make stress Mark's point, I love when you have a randomized controlled trial that randomizes students within classrooms, as if the students don't talk to each other or sit with each other at lunchtime, yet we assume that no network exists. So have we actually seen the spillover effect measured in this context? Not yet, we're working on it. But it's totally possible when it happens in all other sorts of treatment, including other public health experiments like family planning efforts in villages, contraceptive use, and actually water treatment factors as well. The other thing I want to address, which is both. Yeah, sure.
So one thing that may not be immediately obvious to everybody to think about is, if we'd been using the spouses and partners as the control group, that program would have looked ineffective.
Right. Exactly.
Right? So it's not that the RCT really is the gold standard. The RCT is the really gold standard if there aren't spillover effects.
Correct.
When you've got a program whose whole point is spillover effects, the RCT will get you the wrong results and get published in a very good journal because it was an RCT.
Right. And that's, I mean, so that obviously we're in agreement here. I want to talk very quickly about spillover.
What part of that is funny? Just
not,
for the record.
All of it.
But to the last question too, about about the sort of spillover effects into the sort of practitioner side, someone in the earlier panel talked about the other side of the network as having the right network of people on the sort of national network side. And having done this enough times with the national network in other cities, seeing cities that struggle or seeing cities that succeed, It's about having that right network as well. And one of the things I think is the biggest indicator of success, which would never be captured or anything, is when certain good things become a routine. So in Chicago, for example, there's a case review system of every shooting. There's the gang audits are part of doing business. There's no longer assuming about a gang structure. They measure it. In New Haven, they started a shooting sort of task force. So we're seeing things that were really hard to do and really hard to build, which is an unintended, well, it's totally intended, but it's one of the things where it's equally about the people and the networks as it is, this other side. There is a small group of folks that sort of have this knowledge, and it's sort of systematizing that and creating that as something that's an unintended byproduct that becomes part of culture and organization.
And Thomas, to that point, since you've seen this from the decision maker perspective, I mean, how do we go about operationalizing and systematizing it for the longer period?
What do you mean?
How do we ensure that it changes from a program or an effort that exists over 5 to 7 years, becomes a part of policing culture, becomes a part of law enforcement culture?
That, I mean...
Did I give you I do the basketball,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah. Thanks for that one. That's sort of the $1 million question. If we all knew that, we would just sort of solve for X and all of these safety problems would go away. I will say that there are some very influential, policymakers who control dollars, OMB, who really do need to see things like randomized controlled trials. And so, you need to sort of think about what audience you need to sort of persuade if you want to sort of, if you want to get to those big piles of money and make the case for expansion.
So one of the bad things about randomized controlled trials is it's easy to cheat. You do 100 randomized controlled trials and you report the one that worked. Drug companies have been doing this for years. So the Food and Drug Administration now requires, if they're going to count a trial toward a drug approval, the trial has to have been registered in advance on a website called trials.gov. So if you did 19 that turned out bad, that's on the record too. It's possible that we could get some additional credibility for things that aren't randomized trials because we're doing it to the whole city, which means you can't really randomize, by registering those efforts in advance. By saying, we're going to do this intervention in this city, and this intervention in this city, and this intervention in this city. And so you've got your start date for the experiment before the data come in, because otherwise people are going to say, oh, you just painted the bullseye around the bullet hole.
So anything else from the crowd, the audience? Yeah, Black.
I was just wondering, somebody before mentioned the importance of seeing and hearing about this so that there's enough spillover effect. And since we're talking about networks, I'm wondering how much some of these approaches have used social media, especially within the most violent networks, and doing what we do today, which is often video-based, to amplify the power of what's going on.
Do you want to go to our network expert?
So the ones that initiatives I've been involved with have not. The interventions themselves or the call-ins have not. The broader people who are doing the work have. So in Bridgeport, Charlie Grady, I don't know if he's here. He's been doing and everybody in Connecticut has been doing a really good job of trying to get the word out outside of the call-in, picnics, events, mentoring programs, and things like that. But the actual sort of treatment itself doesn't really make its way into social media. I will say this though, once we start thinking about even social media networks and how they actually work, you could leverage different, let's just call them the technical things, sort of sampling frames to efficiently diffuse information. We do this for all other sorts of behaviors, and we even exploit them to our advantage, or profit margins, as Mark just kind of alluded to for certain companies. But we can do that for good, and we can use networks for good as well. In terms of using social media in the context of the national network, it depends on which part of the intervention, say the call-in versus a PR campaign versus getting the word out for the march. It seems to be that, I've seen some cities, again, Bridgeport's having a big picnic coming up, and it's all over, their Twitter feed, so check it out. But in terms of the actual call-ins, I haven't seen this. I don't know if that's right or not, David, but.
What we're starting to see, and this is unintended consequences, but it's classic network stuff. The people being called in and getting accustomed to start getting their own stuff on social media. And it's now a way we're tracking the immediate impact of calling because people go home and 3 hours later there'll be a post saying, God is good, they let me come home, all you people gotta chill out, they're not playing. And it's happening all over the country.
We've seen in the callings in Baton Rouge, we call in people that are in prison as well as in juvenile detention. And you listen to prison phone calls that night, the word goes out through thousands of inmates to their families. We also found that obviously focused in terms of folks, as we followed up with the cleanups in the church neighborhoods, we tracked crime following those call-ins in those neighborhoods where they mostly affected. It also has a bigger effect and carries on a longer term. Also, with regard to the person who called in, normally not taking the services, so we've found going to the brothers and sisters, mom and dad of that person, but the brother and sister will wrap around that affected person and get the message to them that they've done.
I have a question directed to Mr. Moore. You began by talking about enforcement action, group enforcement action after the call-in. And I'm from Baton Rouge also. After we're in our 3rd year of Baton Rouge version of implementing ceasefire, we've had some considerable progress. But recently, after one of our big call-ins, one of the groups were responsible for a body hitting the ground. So we targeted the guys, and we were able to enforce in double digits. We contacted the media, crime went down right after that was publicized. Well, since our numbers indicated that after every call-in, the crime numbers reduced in the violent crime categories, we figured we would up the frequency of the call-ins to 4 times per year. My question to you and the panel is regarding the frequencies. Since that time, I know the implementation guide recommends that we should conduct the call-ins as needed. But I guess my question is, should we have in place sufficient intelligence for the enforcement actions before we conduct the call-ins that frequent? It's because right now we kind of, it's just my opinion, to conduct them 4 times a year, quarterly. I know you made a comment about we can't give any free rides. We got to make sure we firm, but with the minimum amount of force necessary on the group enforcement. What is your thoughts on the frequencies?
I can't think of any way in principle to answer the question about what the right frequency is. I guess the answer is do one more than you plan to do and see if crime goes down. I don't know any way to answer that question except trying it out. Except to note that every time you do a call-in, you're making a commitment. So what's going to limit the number of times you can do that is the amount of capacity you have to carry out the commitment. I think that's the answer. I haven't looked at it closely, but basically, if you called me and asked me that, I'd say, wait just a second, put you on hold and call David.
So I would just add to that, this is a very common question, which is, it's working, we should just do it all the time.
Right.
But I mean, it's like, so I have a cold, if you couldn't hear it. Before I had insurance, mine was just take as much possible, Benadryl as I could without passing out at my desk. And even though if I went over the prescribed, so it's this sort of as needed thing, especially if it's focused, as soon as you start increasing it, doing every group in the city, or doing, not only do you expand the capacity to enforce that threat, as it were, it's no longer focused in some ways. There's the real answer is what Mark said, which is test it, see what happens. But this is also to get back to play devil's advocate on ourselves. This is why without causal data, especially in smaller cities where there's no comparison group, do we know that those shootings that went down were the people that were in the room that got the treatment? Or is you looking at a total rate? So there's a lot more complicated ways, because if it's just all crime went down, you have no idea And I've been very critical of other programs that have done this. That, look, crime went down, we get credit for it. You know, that's not good enough for me. It's good enough for people that are getting elected and things like that. And now that I have tenure, I'll never have to worry about anything like that again. But I mean, that's what I would do. I would test it, and I would make sure you're measuring the right thing. Right? If it's group involved, it should be group involved. If it's those 3 groups, is it those 3 groups? And test it out. But I don't think there's a right answer.
I mean, even testing out is tricky. I mean, as I think about it. So we test it out, and yeah, something we're measuring goes down right after the call-in. Well, that's good. You don't really know whether doing that extra call-in weakened the currency of call-in. I'm worried about a slogan that's very popular with drug addicts and enforcement officials. If some is good, more is better. If some is good, some may be the right amount. I think I'd want a reason to do what they're calling. I don't think I'd do it just because it's July. That doesn't seem right.
Thomas?
You know, I think one of the things, if you read David's book, that I think is very, very powerful, and it's something, you know, I'm a former prosecutor coming up in law enforcement, that it was very hard to get my mind around, and I think it's probably hard for a lot of us who sort of grew up in that community, which is the idea of like talking to these guys. And because in our mind, we think we're in the catching bad guys business, so why would we give notice? Because that would mean that they might stop actually doing it, we wouldn't get to catch them. I sometimes tell this story about, you know, luckily I was a pretty effective prosecutor, but I didn't win all my cases. And often when you didn't win a case, I was here at the Manhattan DA's office, what people would say is, don't worry, he'll be back. And that would kill me. And so I was saying, so you're saying that my failure means that another crime will happen? I don't want him to be back. I want him to be so scared that he never does it again. And so what I think the power of this is talking to the people that you're trying to deter is important. And to get back to the point, you can't muddy the message. So if you're just calling them in just because it's time for the quarterly meeting, have you muddied the message, and then are you really, communicating a clear message, which is, we had a problem, we have the capacity to solve that problem, address it yourself, or we're gonna exercise enforcement.
And I'm making this one up, but it sounds like something the National Network would do. That could also be the time to do the other work, right? Which is the other little big stuff, as well as sort of really focusing on to get ahead of the curve on other things. That might even be a better way to leverage, the time rather than just doing more of it, which is consistent with this focused message, and giving some other space.
I think it's kind of the ironic part of law enforcement as it's currently set up, with Thomas, what you're pointing out, that as a former prosecutor, we tend to get all the guys that it doesn't work with, that you don't get solutions for. So you get the feedback loop on what's negative, not on what's positive. Right? So we become experts in what doesn't work, and experts in what does work. John, you had a question?
I was going to say, just, I think one of the insights of focused deterrence is kind of remarkable to that. If you over-apply something, you're going to have a weakened deterrent effect. So I would be, that's essentially mass incarceration, right? It takes something that probably works a little bit, but it says, well, it works a little bit, it doesn't work a lot if you apply more evidence. So I would be, I think tested, of course, but I'd be very skeptical of kind of the logic that got us here.
Go ahead.
I feel like one of the tensions I've been hearing, common thread, is policymakers wanting evidence-based solutions, and then, as kind of Papachristos wrote in Too Big to Fail, kind of evaluations become more of an art than science sometimes. And so for the policymakers in the room, how do we be better consumers of evidence, social science, and for the research nerds in the room, how can we better produce and write for policymakers what the evidence we have out there?
Who gets that first? How about Thomas? You want to go first? I'll give you another one. I'll give you Mark. Mark, you can do it first.
I don't know. I don't do any research and I don't make any policy, so I'm not sure I'm the right one to ask.
I could actually take that.
Go ahead.
I'll follow.
So
No inspiration.
this is something that I've thought a lot about. So I think that and you know, I had the privilege of being in justice when we started the Evidence Integration Initiative and working with Phelan Wyrick and Roy Robinson, and it's being continued by Assistant Attorney General Mason. And so that a lot of my thoughts are informed by that. But then we started a research roundtable on criminal justice in New York. What policymakers need on the research side is they need research that is relevant, meaning it's on a subject that the policy and practitioner community care about. It needs to be timely. So, you know, we can't ask a research question and get an answer, you know, 5 years later. It has to be accessible, which doesn't necessarily mean that you need to write your peer-reviewed journal in accessible language, but you need to do a companion policy piece and maybe an op-ed. The other thing that I think is important that a lot of people don't talk about is it has to be impactful. And what we should really be aiming for with research is something that someone once called interocular effects. And what that is effects that hit you right between the eyes. Statistical significance is often not a useful measure in terms of policy. All that means is if something is statistically significant, it means it was very unlikely that it happened by chance. It doesn't mean it's actually substantively significant. So having impactful research. And then I think also research that is independent and credible, because in the long term we want to rely on that evidence. So that's on the researcher side. On the policymaker side, obviously we should follow where the data and the evidence leads us. You know, we have lots of people now. The good news is that lots of people are saying that they're doing that now. The not so good news is that not everybody who is saying that they're doing that is actually doing that, but we're making progress. I think that the key there is sort of my beginning point, which is that we need to pay a lot of attention to the synthesis and the emphasis, and bringing this evidence together and saying, what does it mean in ways that we can communicate to our colleagues, you know, in law enforcement agencies, and probation departments, and community-based organizations in an accessible way that they can actually use. The answer can't be, you know, go to the Journal of Experimental Criminology, because that ain't happening.
It's worth saying there's evidence-based. I mean, I understand the impulse behind saying it. It's a very, very, very treacherous slogan. Partly, every proprietor of a nonsense for-profit program will pay some assistant professor someplace to do a survey of the staff, and the staff says, yes, it's a wonderful program, and okay, we now got an evidence base for the program. And a lot of the places that compile these things will say, okay, there's a study that shows the program's good, I guess it's evidence-based. The other issue is that the opposite of evidence-based is innovative, right? So, I mean, I'm pushing this graduated reentry idea, which I admit may or may not be a good idea. And people say, well, where's it been tried? And I say, well, no, you're nowhere yet. You want to be first? Well, no, I think I'll be third. Somebody's got to be willing to try something that's not already been done. I would distinguish between evidence-based programs and programs founded on evidence-based principles, right? Is the principle of focused deterrence been proven? Oh, yeah. Has the principles of swift and certainty been proven? Oh, yeah. Do we know a lot about perceived fairness? Yeah. You can design a program that nobody's ever done before and say, look, it ought to work because it's based on these 6 principles. Now, that's not going to say it's not going to turn around and bite you on the ankle, because something won't work right. But I don't think we should be too slavish about only doing things that have been done before.
So I just want to, I'm sorry, please.
I just wanted to comment on that and say that, at least from the Office of Justice Program's perspective, we want innovation. And I think that I would go a little further than you and not say it has to be based on, it's got to be designed to build the body of evidence. The body of evidence, maybe it doesn't work. It ought to be designed so that we can learn something from it. To me, that's what we're all about. We're trying to do that, and not just see programs that, oh, I'm just going to do this, and I'm going to check it to see what the effect
Just one more thing to say about that. The fact that a program works someplace means that it works there. Once you do it someplace else with a different population, a different institutional structure, a different set of cultures, it might not. I mean, people keep asking me whether they have Dutch drug policies in this country because they seem to work pretty well in the Netherlands. I say, yeah, as soon as we've got a Dutch population, try them on. So just the fact that something's evidence-based in the sense that there is a good, let's just imagine there's a very good trial at some place, and yeah, we're pretty sure it worked there. That's a hint that you might be able to adapt those same ideas to your conditions. But everybody wants to imitate Hawaii Hope. Well, you know, if there aren't pineapples around, those might not be exactly the right operating structures for your environment. So innovate. I mean, this is jazz, not classical piano.
Let's go to Andy Van Dam.
So just two quick, I actually love this question, but I want to actually call the researchers and scholars out a little bit as well. Both the people that are producing the work and then also the consumers. And one is, you know, social science right now is in a very unique opportunity. We're taking a lot of hits in the media, whether we're talking about young men in Philadelphia or housewives in Manhattan or gay canvassers in political discourse, and none of us have actually stepped up to say, you know, that's not acceptable ways of collecting data or approaching data or interpreting data. We actually have methods. Not all are experimental, and data has different value. Not everything needs to be an experiment. Even though I like to do quasi-experiments, I do historical work, textual work, ethnographic work, and they all add a different type of value. So part of our job is as a group for scholars to really hold ourselves to that standard and explain people what that means. And we should say and comment on these debates as they arise in the media. But also understanding when the right, you know, it should all be driven by a question and not a data. So my who got shot question, I need to bring up the question. I'd like to take credit for it, but it wasn't me. And then I was stuck in my head, and then I worked backwards from like Jeopardy in some ways. But I think social scientists actually need to spend more time on how they produce their data and what they can and can't tell you. Experiments can tell you one thing, non-experimental things can tell you another thing. In terms of writing, I mean, you know, we're awful writers by and large. Not all of us, but most of us. Very few people have the gift that Malcolm Gladwell has or David Kennedy has, where they can translate social science for real people, citizens, ordinary citizens. Us not being real people. It's a gift, but there's things you can do. I mean, it's not just writing an op-ed, it's telling academics how to write an op-ed that has to be 650 words, right? Trying to get me to write 650 words is impossible. I do it, but it's really hard, and I don't know the right word. I mean, so there's a lot of actual skills that need to happen, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation did a great job of doing this, of training a generation of academics and health researchers, putting them through op-ed boot camp, teaching them how to write a policy brief. You know, there are skills that we need to have as well, and there's soft skills, and academics don't always talk well with people either. So, you know, making sure that you have the right academic is not, you know, there's not a nice way to say that, but yeah, have the right academic, the people that can talk with the program folks as well as just crunch numbers or whatever it is that they do in that particular program. So I think it's important to both put understand and discuss what good data is. It's not just having data, but I think, as we just pointed out, innovating on data collection methods as well. There's lots of room for it, hopefully, but it's on us to write about it and express that in a way that's meaningful.
Thomas, you have the last word?
Yeah, I just think it's important to avoid the extremes here. Obviously, we don't know everything, and when something is labeled evidence-based, it isn't necessarily so, and we need to be good, sophisticated consumers of evidence. But at the same time, we know a lot. We know a lot, and so, you know, we have to be careful. You know, academics often sort of switch between these two things, which is they sort of pound the table and they say, you know, we've studied this and it's X. Or, you know, other times, you know, if they're, you know, feeling in a different mood, they say, well, who knows, you know, these issues of external validity. But I think that you know, obviously policy is going to be made in the middle. there. And I think that, 10 years ago, nobody was talking about evidence-based policy, or not very many people were talking about it. Now we're talking about it. 10 years from now, we're going to be talking about it in a much more sophisticated way, and people will get called out when they say they're being evidence-based, and they're not, in fact. And so, really, maybe the way to sort of add some nuance here is not focus on evidence-based policy, because policy is never going to be controlled solely by research, and it shouldn't be, but it should be informed by evidence. Evidence-informed policy is where we want to go. And I completely agree with AAG Mason in that, particularly when you're talking about research that is funded with taxpayer money, that research has to be in the public interest.
And that'll have to be our last word.